The Haunting of Serenity Asylum. Adriana stood at the gates of Serenity Asylum, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and trepidation. The old, remote mental institution loomed before her, its stone walls covered in ivy and its windows dark and foreboding. She had always wanted to help those in need, and this job as a nurse was her chance to make a difference. But the asylum had a dark history, and rumors of patients disappearing and strange occurrences cast a long shadow over her optimism. The heavy iron gates creaked open as she stepped through, her footsteps echoing on the cobblestone path. The asylum was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant call of an owl. Adriana tightened her grip on her bag and took a deep breath. She could do this. Inside, the air was stale and cold. The long, dimly lit corridors stretched out like the arteries of a dying beast. She made her way to the nurse's station, where she was greeted by a weary-looking woman named Nurse Collins. "Welcome to Serenity Asylum," Nurse Collins said, her voice devoid of enthusiasm. "I'm sure you've heard the stories. Just keep your head down and do your job, and you'll be fine." Adriana nodded, trying to ignore the knot of fear in her stomach. She had been hired to replace a nurse who had died under mysterious circumstances, a fact that unnerved her but also motivated her to help the patients who needed her. Her first night shift began quietly enough. Adriana made her rounds, checking on the patients, administering medication, and offering words of comfort. Most of the patients were docile, lost in their own worlds. But as the night wore on, she began to notice eerie things. Whispering voices that seemed to come from nowhere, flickering lights that cast dancing shadows on the walls, and shadows that moved on their own. In one of the rooms, she found an elderly patient named Mrs. Bradford. The frail woman sat in a rocking chair, her eyes fixed on the window. "Good evening, Mrs. Bradford," Adriana said softly. "How are you feeling tonight?" Mrs. Bradford turned her head slowly, her eyes filled with a strange intensity. "Beware the doctor," she whispered. "He watches from the shadows. He waits." Adriana frowned. "The doctor?" Mrs. Bradford nodded, her voice trembling. "The spirit of a cruel man. He performed terrible experiments on us. His ghost still haunts these halls, searching for his next victim." Adriana shivered. She had heard rumors of a malevolent spirit, but she had dismissed them as mere superstition. Now, faced with Mrs. Bradford's fear, she wasn't so sure. As the night progressed, Adriana's unease grew. The whispering voices became more insistent, and she felt a constant chill on the back of her neck, as if someone were watching her. She tried to focus on her duties, but the sense of impending doom was impossible to shake. At around midnight, Adriana decided to take a break in the staff lounge. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down, trying to steady her nerves. The room was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. When she opened them, she saw him. A tall, gaunt figure in a blood-stained lab coat stood in the doorway, his eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The doctor. Adriana's heart skipped a beat. She tried to move, but her body was frozen with fear. The doctor stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "Come with me," he whispered, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "I have something to show you." Adriana shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "No, I won't go with you." The doctor's face twisted into a cruel smile. "You will. They all do." With that, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Adriana felt a strange compulsion to follow him, as if an invisible hand were pulling her along. She tried to resist, but her feet moved of their own accord. The doctor led her to an abandoned wing of the asylum, a place she had been warned to avoid. The air grew colder as they walked, and the walls seemed to close in around her. Adriana's fear turned to terror as she realized she had no control over her actions. The doctor stopped in front of a heavy wooden door. "This is where it happened," he said softly. "This is where I performed my greatest work." He pushed the door open, revealing a room filled with old medical equipment, rusty scalpels, broken vials, and blood-stained sheets. The air was thick with the stench of decay. Adriana's mind screamed for her to run, but her body remained rooted to the spot. The doctor moved closer, his cold hand reaching out to touch her face. "You will be my masterpiece," he whispered. Just as the doctor's hand brushed her cheek, a voice rang out. "Leave her alone." Mrs. Bradford stood in the doorway, her frail form trembling with determination. The doctor turned, his eyes narrowing. "Leave, old woman," he hissed. "This does not concern you." But Mrs. Bradford stood her ground. "You've taken enough from us. You won't take her too." With a strength that belied her age, Mrs. Bradford stepped forward, placing herself between Adriana and the doctor. The ghost snarled, reaching out to grab her, but she was ready. She held up a small, silver crucifix, the metal gleaming in the dim light. The doctor recoiled, his form flickering. "You can't stop me," he growled. Mrs. Bradford's voice was steady. "I can try." With a scream of rage, the doctor lunged at Mrs. Bradford. Adriana watched in horror as the ghostly figure engulfed the elderly woman, their forms intertwining in a maelstrom of darkness and light. For a moment, it seemed as if the doctor would prevail. But Mrs. Bradford's resolve was unyielding. With a final, desperate cry, she pushed the doctor back, her body glowing with an ethereal light. The doctor's form shattered, his spirit dissolving into nothingness. Adriana fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Bradford lay on the floor, her breathing shallow. Adriana crawled over to her, taking her hand. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Mrs. Bradford smiled weakly. "It was my time. Be strong, Adriana. Protect them." With those words, the light in Mrs. Bradford's eyes faded, and she was gone. Adriana stayed by her side for a long time, the weight of the night's events pressing down on her. She had survived, but the cost had been high. Mrs. Bradford had sacrificed herself to save her, and now it was her duty to honor that sacrifice. In the days and weeks that followed, Adriana remained at Serenity Asylum. She continued her work with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to protect the patients and staff from the dark forces that lurked within the asylum's walls. She was vigilant, always on the lookout for signs of the doctor's return. The asylum seemed quieter now, as if a great weight had been lifted. The whispering voices were gone, and the flickering lights no longer cast ominous shadows. But Adriana knew that the peace was fragile, and she could not afford to let her guard down. One evening, as Adriana sat in her office reviewing patient files, she felt a familiar chill on the back of her neck. She looked up, her heart pounding. In the corner of the room, a shadowy figure stood, watching her with glowing eyes. Adriana took a deep breath, steeling herself. She knew what she had to do. The battle with the doctor was far from over, but she was ready. She would confront the malevolent spirit, protect the patients, and honor Mrs. Bradford's sacrifice. The doctor's sinister presence loomed ever closer, but Adriana stood her ground. She was no longer just a nurse at Serenity Asylum. She was its guardian, and she would not let the darkness win. As the shadowy figure moved towards her, Adriana reached for the silver crucifix that Mrs. Bradford had given her. The doctor would find no easy prey here. The haunting of Serenity Asylum would continue, but so would Adriana's fight to keep the evil at bay. She was determined to protect those in her care, no matter the cost. The final scene showed Adriana standing tall, the crucifix shining brightly in her hand, as the shadowy figure approached. Her expression was one of unwavering resolve, ready to face whatever horrors awaited her. The Lost Visitor. Stonegate Asylum stood ominously against the backdrop of a darkening sky. The long-abandoned mental institution, with its broken windows and ivy-covered walls, was a place of mystery and fear. For years, it had been the subject of countless ghost stories and urban legends. Owen and his group of friends, seeking a thrill and hoping to capture some paranormal activity for their online channel, decided it was the perfect location for their next adventure. "Are you guys ready?" Owen asked, excitement evident in his voice as he adjusted the camera strapped to his chest. The small group consisted of Parker, his closest friend, Angeline, the fearless one, and Jake, the tech guru. "Ready as we'll ever be," Parker replied, though his unease was palpable. He had always been more cautious than the others, and the idea of exploring Stonegate Asylum filled him with dread. "Let's do this," Angeline said, her flashlight cutting through the encroaching darkness as they approached the entrance. Jake followed, lugging a backpack filled with equipment. The iron gates of Stonegate Asylum groaned as they pushed them open. The courtyard was overgrown with weeds, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. As they crossed the threshold into the asylum, a sense of foreboding settled over them. Inside, the asylum was a labyrinth of decaying corridors and empty rooms. The walls were lined with peeling paint, and the floors were littered with debris. The group's footsteps echoed through the silence as they moved cautiously through the building. "This place is seriously creepy," Angeline remarked, her voice breaking the heavy silence. "But it's perfect for our video." Parker stayed close to the group, his eyes darting around nervously. "I don't like this, guys. We should be careful." Owen laughed. "Relax, Parker. It's just an old building. Nothing to worry about." They ventured deeper into the asylum, finding old patient records scattered on the floor, rusty medical equipment, and remnants of a dark past. The more they explored, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. In one of the rooms, they discovered a set of old patient records. Owen picked up a file and began to read aloud. "Patient 1042. Admitted for severe paranoia and hallucinations. Claims to see figures in the shadows." Angeline shivered. "That's creepy. Imagine being locked up in here, seeing things that aren't there." Parker glanced nervously at the shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. "Yeah, imagine that." As they continued their exploration, they stumbled upon a door partially hidden behind a collapsed wall. Jake managed to pry it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. "Looks like we've found the basement," Owen said, his excitement growing. "Let's check it out." The basement was even more unsettling than the floors above. The air was damp and cold, and the sound of dripping water echoed through the narrow passageways. The group moved cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. At the end of the passage, they found another door. This one was heavy and reinforced, with a sign that read "Restricted Access. Authorized personnel only." "This must be where they kept the really crazy stuff," Angeline said, her voice hushed. They forced the door open and stepped inside. The room was filled with old medical equipment, cages, and chains. In the center of the room was a large, blood-stained table. On a nearby shelf, they found a disturbing journal written by a former patient. Owen picked up the journal and began to read. "April 3rd, 1952. The doctor has started his experiments again. He says he's trying to cure us, but all he does is hurt us. I can hear the others screaming at night. I know I'm next." Angeline's face turned pale. "This is sick. What kind of place was this?" As they looked around, Parker began to feel an overwhelming sense of dread. He heard faint whispers and distant screams, but when he mentioned it, the others dismissed his fears. "You're just letting your imagination get to you," Owen said. "Let's get some footage and get out of here." After filming the room and its horrifying contents, the group decided to leave. But as they retraced their steps, they found that the way they had come in was gone. The corridors seemed to twist and change, leading them deeper into the asylum. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped. The air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, echoing through the halls. One by one, the friends began to disappear under mysterious circumstances. First, Jake vanished while checking a map on his tablet. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone, leaving his equipment scattered on the floor. Angeline disappeared next, her scream echoing through the corridors before being abruptly cut off. Owen and Parker were the only ones left. They clung to each other, desperate to find a way out. The asylum seemed to close in around them, the walls pressing in as if the building itself were alive. Owen and Parker frantically searched for an exit, their flashlights flickering as the darkness seemed to close in around them. The whispers grew louder, and the temperature dropped even further. "There's no way out," Parker said, his voice trembling. "We're trapped here forever." Owen refused to accept it. "No, there has to be a way. We can't just give up." But as they ran, they realized that the asylum's layout had changed. The rooms and corridors twisted and turned in impossible ways, leading them back to the hidden room again and again. The walls seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and the air was thick with a sense of dread. Exhausted and defeated, Owen and Parker collapsed in the hidden room. The journal lay open on the floor, its pages filled with their desperate attempts to escape. As they read the latest entry, their hearts sank. October 21st, 2023, "We are trapped in the asylum. The walls are closing in, and the whispers won't stop. One by one, we are disappearing. Jake is gone. Angeline is gone. Only Owen and I are left. We have to find a way out." Owen's face went white. "This can't be happening. How is this possible?" Parker looked around, his fear turning into a cold certainty. "The asylum, it's alive. It's feeding on our fear." As they turned to leave, they found themselves back at the hidden room's entrance. No matter which way they went, they always ended up back there. The asylum was toying with them, trapping them in an endless loop. Desperate and determined, Owen and Parker decided to try a different approach. They would focus on remaining calm and logical, hoping that by not feeding the asylum's hunger for fear, they might find a way out. They retraced their steps, carefully marking their path with pieces of debris. But their hope was short-lived. As they moved through the corridors, the asylum seemed to react to their defiance. The walls began to close in, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The air became thick and oppressive, making it difficult to breathe. "We have to stay calm," Owen said, his voice steady despite the growing fear. "We can't let it win." Parker nodded, though his eyes were filled with terror. "Right? Stay calm." They continued through the maze-like corridors, the path they had marked disappearing behind them. The asylum's malevolent presence seemed to grow stronger, as if it were feeding off their very existence. Finally, they stumbled upon a large, open room they had not seen before. In the center was an ornate chair, covered in dust and cobwebs. It looked like a throne, commanding the room with an air of sinister authority. Owen and Parker approached cautiously. As they did, they felt a cold wind sweep through the room, and the whispers grew louder, forming coherent words. "Welcome," a disembodied voice said, echoing through the room. "You have come far, but there is no escape. You belong to Stonegate now." The air grew colder, and a figure materialized in the chair. It was the ghostly form of a man, dressed in an old-fashioned doctor's coat, his eyes glowing with a malevolent light. "The doctor," Parker whispered, his voice trembling. The doctor's ghost stood up, his presence overwhelming. "I have been waiting for you. Your fear nourishes me, gives me strength. You will never leave this place." Owen stepped forward, his resolve hardening. "We're not afraid of you. We will find a way out." The doctor laughed, a sound that sent chills down their spines. "Brave words, but futile. This asylum is my domain. Your fates are sealed." As the doctor advanced, Owen and Parker felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew colder. But Owen refused to give up. He grabbed a piece of debris from the floor and threw it at the doctor's ghost. The object passed through the ghostly figure, but the action seemed to anger the doctor. He raised his hand, and the room shook violently. Parker was thrown to the ground, and Owen struggled to keep his footing. "You cannot defeat me," the doctor said, his voice filled with fury. "You are mine." Desperate, Owen looked around the room, searching for anything that could help them. His eyes fell on an old, rusted scalpel lying on a nearby table. He grabbed it and held it up, hoping it might have some effect on the malevolent spirit. The doctor paused, his eyes narrowing. "You think a simple blade can harm me?" Owen's mind raced. He had to think of something, anything to stop the doctor. Suddenly, an idea struck him. "It's not the blade," he said, his voice steady. "It's the will to fight back." With a determined look, Owen lunged at the doctor, the scalpel passing through the ghostly form. The doctor screamed, a sound of pure rage and pain. The walls shook, and the whispers grew louder, echoing through the room. Parker scrambled to his feet and joined Owen, their combined resolve seeming to weaken the doctor's hold on the asylum. The ghostly figure flickered, its form becoming less substantial. "You cannot defeat me," the doctor hissed, his voice filled with desperation. But Owen and Parker stood their ground, their determination unwavering. "We will not be your victims," Owen said, his voice strong. "We will not feed your hunger." With a final scream, the doctor's ghost shattered into 1,000 pieces, the remnants dissipating into the air. The room fell silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. Exhausted and shaken, Owen and Parker made their way back through the asylum. The corridors no longer twisted and changed, and the path to the exit was clear. They moved quickly, their fear replaced by a newfound sense of determination. As they reached the front gates, they paused, looking back at the looming structure of Stonegate Asylum. The building seemed less malevolent now, its dark presence diminished. "We did it," Parker said, his voice filled with relief. "We beat him." Owen nodded, though he knew the experience would stay with them forever. "Let's get out of here." They pushed open the iron gates and stepped out into the fresh night air. The weight of the asylum finally lifted from their shoulders. As they walked away from Stonegate Asylum, Owen and Parker felt a sense of victory. They had faced the darkness and survived. But as they reached the edge of the forest, Owen glanced back at the asylum one last time. To his horror, he saw the faint outline of the doctor's ghost standing at the gates, watching them. The malevolent presence had not been defeated, only diminished. "We need to warn others," Owen said, his voice trembling. "The asylum isn't done with us." Parker nodded, understanding the gravity of their situation. "We have to make sure no one else falls into its trap." As they walked away, the doctor's ghost faded into the shadows, a reminder that the darkness of Stonegate Asylum would never truly be vanquished. The asylum's hunger for fear and despair remained, waiting for its next victims. Owen and Parker knew they could never escape the shadow of Stonegate Asylum, but they were determined to prevent others from falling into its clutches. The horror they had faced would stay with them forever, a dark reminder of the malevolent presence that still lurked within the asylum's walls.